We're back for our EPS happy hour. I've got another fantastic traveler and personal friend joining us today, Becky Pokora of Sightdoing. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So we in our group we don't generally allow lectures or comments about telling people how they should travel, but you've got a provocative name for your blog, Sightdoing. So tell us what we should be doing and what we've been doing wrong all along.
Sure. So, sightdoing is all about the experiences that you have along the way rather than the big bus tours or the photographs you snap while traveling at 1,000 miles per hour. So, for me, it's about really kind of trying to connect with the destination and get to know it in a meaningful way. That
Hmm.
can mean different things to different people, obviously. Um, but it's oftentimes about meeting people along the way, trying out different activities or participating in cultural elements, whatever you can realistically join in. Um, and being able to walk away with that experience and feeling like you actually got to know that destination a little bit better.
Fantastic. And um, a lot of times we've had discussions here about the business of blogging and setting up a website and that. So I wanted to take a little detour and talk about that because you have had a few iterations of your online presence, more frequent flyer program focused at one point, different blog names. So talk about the evolution, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and getting you to the point you are today.
Yeah. So for me, one of the reasons I got away from blogging and frequent flyer miles, which ironically I dabble in with freelancing, but not on a blog level, was it started to feel more like work to me. And I wanted my blog to feel more like that outlet
Mhm.
um, of being excited about travel all the time. And if you're
Mm.
forcing it and working on it, you kind
Yeah.
of lose a lot of that excitement. Um, in general, I think it's a lot about making sure that you have some sort of angle and it doesn't have to be catchy or kitschy. It just needs to be, um, how do you travel that's different from other people or something like that.
Mhm.
Otherwise, nobody will want to come back and read a second or a third story. You will just be one of the masses. And goodness knows that there is probably 10,000 travel blogs on the internet right now. Don't quote me on that number because I've never counted, but there are certainly a lot of them. And if you Google for any category in travel, I'm sure you've seen all the results come back. But
Mhm.
if you want somebody to keep reading you specifically, I think you have to have some sort of a voice or some sort of an angle that nobody else has.
And it seems, I think, we're in the same boat as you in that we're not just focused on one destination in our travel life, and that seems the angle that works for a lot of places. This is the
For sure.
food blog for Milan, and Google knows that that's what it is and knows how to find it. You like to travel everywhere. We like to travel everywhere. So that angle definition becomes all the much harder in terms of Google's deciding how to send people to your blog more than anything these days.
Yeah, that's definitely more important if you're planning on doing this as a full-time income. I have work on the side that pays my bills, which is very fortunate. So I don't have to be quite as concerned about what the Google gods say.
Mhm.
And if I'm on page one for everything, if you were depending on that income for all your bills, I can see how that would be a more driving factor to really specialize and do those very niche topics.
And talk about rebranding and that process mechanically and why you decided to change the name.
Um, I did it mostly because I was getting frustrated with people forgetting the name of my blog or screwing it up and things along that sort. So once I had kind of a more memorable name of Sightdoing that made a lot of sense from a mechanical point of view, you need to set up redirects. I had somebody more technically savvy do a lot of that work for me. Um, but other than that, just kind of throwing your name out there a lot and making sure that people remember it, which would be the same for any business anywhere, not just a blog.
And what's your approach to social media? What platforms do you use? Do you schedule things? How much time do you spend engaging on it?
So I'm mostly on Twitter. That's where you'll find me the most often. I do post a lot on Instagram when I'm actually traveling, so it has been very empty as of late.
Hmm.
Facebook kind of bit me, kind of came back. I had scheduled, there are tools to schedule social media, and I had scheduled Facebook posts out through like August because I just sat down one day and
Hmm.
said, oh, I'll get this all scheduled. And then I spent hours like untangling that about a week or so ago. Because I was like, wow, a lot of this is really not the appropriate thing to say anymore. So, um, I guess be wary of schedulers and realize that you still have to be a human at the end of the day and not just a tool that spits out content.
I think the Twitter comment revealed your points background. I'd say the non-points bloggers and travelers I deal with, it's almost entirely I seem to communicate by Facebook Messenger, occasionally WhatsApp, and it's only the points people that are Twitter direct message. So talk about how you use Twitter effectively for your communication and your travel blogging.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to get into binges of using Twitter a crazy amount and then kind of backing off a little bit to be a human again, that lives offline.
Hmm.
Um, I like Twitter because you can talk to people that you've never met. You don't have to be a connection with them. So you can kind of get to know people that you otherwise might not meet. For me, that's
Mhm.
really interesting. You kind of meet people or exchange with people that might be friends of friends, essentially, whereas on Facebook, that might be more difficult based on
Hmm.
privacy settings. I also like to just use it to kind of scroll through and see what's trending, what people are talking about. Sometimes that
Mhm.
gives me ideas of blog posts to write, or freelance articles to pitch, because I see people that are talking about something. I'm like, wow, I never really thought about that, but I've got something to say.
Mhm. Mhm.
um, so it's kind of a fun way to both communicate and listen. And a lot of bloggers skip the listening part on Twitter.
That's true. They're just pushing out their message and not responding, not engaging so much, which I can understand. It gets overwhelming, but I guess if you're going to put your shingle out there, you might as well make good on it.
Sure.
All right, let's talk about a few travel plans. So, future of travel is up in the air, but I'm going to share a link. So, you did post that you're making some tentative plans. So, talk about what you're thinking of doing for the rest of this year and why.
Yeah, so first on my calendar, which I guess I should put the disclaimer out there that all of these are subject to change at any point in time. But first on my calendar is at the end of July into Minnesota. I am actually supposed to be on a plane right now to Spain, but
Hmm.
clearly that's not happening. So
Hmm. Hmm.
that trip got canceled, and Minnesota is the obvious replacement for Spain. So um, we were very focused on a trip that would be somewhat self sufficient, self catering. So for us, it's going to be a combination of like a cabin rental for a few days, followed by a Boundary Waters canoe trip, which is camping. So you paddle out to your private island or almost private island, and set up your tent. And then the next day, you take your tent down and paddle on to the next lake and the next campsite, and so on and so
Hmm.
forth. So
Let's talk about the size of Boundary Waters because this is a. I'm from Minnesota. I've not actually been, but I grew up around people that would go out there for weeks at a time.
Yeah, so I don't know anything as far as like acreage or any official metrics on that. I suppose I could Google it, but it's massive. You absolutely could go out and canoe for 2 weeks straight and not repeat anything, um, and not double back. Um, there are crazy forums actually, which I did not know existed until about a few weeks ago, of people who are planning their Boundary Waters trips, and they know everything. They've literally gone out for a week or two every summer since
Mhm.
1970 or whatever the case might be. So they've taken every route out there.
Hmm.
So I mean, I would have to guess like hundreds of square miles, like Rhode Island in Minnesota, maybe.
It says, I just pulled it up. It says 1,090,000 acres, which is 4,400 square kilometers.
Yeah, that's kind of mind-boggling to me, and I will see less than 1% of that, I'm sure. Um,
Yeah, and comparing it to what people might just see if they're collecting national parks, Voyageurs National Park, which is in the neighborhood, is certainly smaller and much more because it is adjacent to some commercial areas where people have houses or there's
sure.
some resorts. You're not really getting away from it. We're boundary waters. You really really are.
Yeah, so I mean, that's kind of a secret that outdoorsy people have known for years, but the average traveler might not know. A lot of times, these wilderness areas or state forests or things that don't have an official national park designation are just as incredible as the national parks. And I like to often, even if I do go to a national park, try and pick something that's outside of park boundaries for a day or two later. And you often get just as incredible scenery, but with 10% of the crowds. Um, if you're an outdoorsy person, it's great. If you're just looking to, again, take those photos of the main landmarks, you won't find them outside of park boundaries often.
Yeah, I'm thinking of so many that I've started visiting some of the national parks the past couple of years, and when there might be, I mean, it's truly next door in some cases. It says National Wilderness Area or something, and I've been as guilty as anyone of just driving right past and not not stopping. But the animals, if they're there, probably don't know the difference. And
Exactly.
or there's a state park like Denali National Park. It's very restricted. I was in on the road lottery, so I had freedom to drive. But I mean,
Yeah,
right on the other side of the
my
mountain
bucket list for someday.
Denali State Park is on the other side of the mountain, to the south, closer to Anchorage, and you could go in there much more easily and have much more variety of activity. The road lottery, it was an okay experience. Greg Frequent Miler and I went, and it isn't one we would repeat. And part of it is you have to guess. You have to put in what days you're trying for in the lottery, and so I picked the middle of the weekdays,
Mm-hmm.
thinking I'd have better chance. So I did win. I won on the first try, but the way the weekend fell, that was the last day of the road lottery, and we met a lot of people that had been year after year, and they said that the first day is the best because it's even though it's only I forget 200 vehicles per day that are allowed in, it's still much more than the wildlife are used to encountering. So by the last day, many of them are very far away. So what we did see was when we would just pull up the car over wherever we saw people with lenses longer than our arms and and say, "Can we take a look at whatever you're looking at?" And they were always nice to give us a quick peek and see, oh, there's a bear very very far away.
Very nice. Yeah, that's a good tip for everybody to know if they're putting in for that lottery.
Yeah, and that I guess the lottery, I'm sure it's not running now, but I think the deadline is usually the end of May every year to enter, and it's for early September. And there's another one, a state park. I'm forgetting the name now that the locals were saying that's a lottery that they also put in for a very intensive bear viewing in most years. So yeah, there's a lot of these little inside or North America ones. Another that you have visited is a neighbor state of Minnesota, so North Dakota. So talk about the national park that you visited there.
Yeah, so this is one of those cases of kind of trying to check the box that I
Mhm.
felt guilty to. I went to North Dakota on my quest for all 50 states.
Mhm.
I was in South Dakota legitimately,
Mhm.
and I had to get to Montana, and I said, well, I'll just drive the long way. That makes sense. So I went to the town of Medora, which is in western North Dakota, and to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, which is the North Dakota Badlands. And generally speaking, I was blown away. I thought I would get to North Dakota and be very happy that I checked it off my state list.
Mhm.
And I found out that now I want to go back and give it a more realistic time frame and spend some time there. The scenery there is not just prairies, there are beautiful rolling hills. I won't call them mountains, but definitely rolling hills.
Mhm.
Beautiful grasslands on these hills with sagebrush everywhere. I was there in mid September, so some of the sagebrush was starting to turn color along with some of the other foliage in the area. So just gorgeous colors. Lots of wildlife. If you like to hike, you will love that there is absolutely nobody on the trail except for you, which is great until you realize that there's a herd of bison like 100 yards away from you, and it's just you and these 2,000-pound animals. It's pretty cool. The town of Medora did not really entice me very much. It's incredibly touristy.
Okay.
Very nice people, but it felt like I was like in Ocean City, Maryland, or something like
Oh, wow.
in the middle of North Dakota. So that was unexpected to me. But the park itself was beautiful. And again, there were a lot of places I drove through that were not national park land that were also stunning. And I wish I had had 4 or 5 days instead of 2.
Yeah, and it is in the far, far west of North Dakota. So you could, as you said, you combined it coming up from South Dakota, but
Yeah.
some of the other parks may be more famous in Wyoming or Montana. You're still talking about giant distances, but
Yeah, but the speed limit there is often 80 miles an hour, so
yeah.
you make good time.
And yeah, I'm thinking of visiting my parents in Minnesota if my wife will approve, and from Seattle to home, it looks like it's about 24 hours door to door, according to Google. But I think Google knows my typical speed, which might be different than the posted speed. So I'm not sure if it's 24 for everyone, but I've never taken that drive, and not really excited to give it a whirl. Let's talk about a very different kind of national parks and reserves way over in Kenya. So the Dream Kenya safaris can often be quite expensive. They don't have to be. And you wrote a great post about tips that you wish you had known before you got there and before you booked.
Yeah, so before anybody thinks that I did this on a super budget, it may have been cheaper than a lot of those crazy dream safaris you see out there, but it did still cost me a pretty good chunk of change. So I don't want to give anybody the impression that it was free.
Mm-hmm.
So Kenya was really cool. One of the things that appealed to me about Kenya versus some other countries in Africa was there is a wide variety of places to see there. It's not just game reserves. And I guess probably more importantly, you can relatively easily reach some of those other places, right? Because I'm sure every country in Africa has many things to offer, but they might not actually be very accessible or close together where you can kind of link them into a single trip. So for me, that was a big piece of it. I went in December, which is kind of their shoulder season between the rainy season and the dry season. I did a lot of research before determining that that was going to be a good fit for me. It ended up being like record-breaking floods. So just remember that weather is still not exactly controlled by mankind here. So definitely check seasonality before you book anything, at least to kind of hope for the best, even if things don't work exactly your way. And one of the things I definitely noticed was not just the weather, but animals do have favorite places to hang out in different times of year. So we went to one reserve that was supposed to be known for I stayed at a lodge that overlooks this beautiful valley, which was beautiful all year probably. And you can just see, in theory, hundreds of elephants below you while you're up on the top of a hillside looking down into this valley. And it turns out the elephants are not there in December. So that was one of those things where you should do better research than I did. I read a lot of reviews and it seemed like a great place to stay. It ended up being a great place to stay for entirely different reasons. But if you are going somewhere specifically to see wildlife on safari, especially if you're paying hundreds or thousands of dollars to make that experience happen, make sure you check to make sure that you're there at the right time. That was a big one for me.
And talk about, you got so many different names and places. You've got Masai Mara, which isn't actually a national park, but maybe the most famous.
Correct.
Serengeti National Park is Tanzania, which is part of which is on the border, but you can't,
Right.
tourists
So the
can't cross.
Masai Mara and the Serengeti are the same ecosystem, but they
Mhm.
do border each other. There's just an invisible country line going down the middle of there. So
Mhm.
the animals cross at will, even though you cannot.
Mhm.
Um, I did not go there again because it was just the wrong time of year to be in that park.
Mhm.
That is definitely the most popular place to go. I've heard that there are great animal sightings, just not in December.
Hmm.
So I went to a lot of lesser known parks, at least for international visitors. A lot of people don't know about it for their first trip to Kenya. So I went to Savo West, Savo East, and Amboseli National Parks. Those were the three main ones where I did a very traditional safari with game drives like you're
Mhm.
picturing. I also went to the Tata Hills Game Reserve, which is a private game reserve. And then up north of Nairobi, in the Naivasha area, there are several national parks there that are less traditional safari areas and are more for scenery and smaller game. So I kind of saw a pretty, compared to someone who only goes to the Masai Mara and probably has incredible experiences watching animals for a week, I instead saw many different places for a shorter amount of time each, which falls into that rapid travel category, I think, that you are very well known for.
I did have a 23-hour connection in Nairobi once, and I went out to Hell's Gate National Park, which is just a few hours to the northwest of Nairobi, and it's yeah, it's not one where you're going to have all your dreams of every large animal. It actually allows what self-drive and I think cycling or even walking. It's a
Yes,
good.
I went there and I rented a bike.
Mhm.
Forgetting that how bad roads are in Kenya, which you could probably speak to also. Anybody who's been there can talk about.
Three flat tires in that 23 hours. I
Yeah,
almost missed my flight
basically.
because it just kept going and going.
Yeah, for some reason, it didn't cross my mind that if that's how bad the road is for driving, then you can imagine what it's like for biking.
Yeah.
So that was an idea that was probably better in my head than in reality, but it is kind of cool. I biked into that park and I was literally the only person I saw, the only bike, the only human, the only car
Mhm.
for probably the first hour and a half or 2 hours of the morning.
Wow.
Most people that go there are coming in as a day trip from Nairobi, and I had actually spent the night. So
Okay.
when I entered the park at 6:45 or 7 in the morning, there was nobody, and there was just this family of warthogs getting a little bit closer than I wanted them to. It might not be a lion, but you still, when it's just you and a bike and a couple of big horned warthogs, you kind of worry a little bit. So
If there were what animals in those parks that I would need to watch for hours and hours, warthogs might be the top of my list. Maybe the meerkats, the the zebras. I've joked with friends on these. It's more zebras. You're spoiled because you see the zebras everywhere and a lot of them.
yeah, there's some pretty cool animals in there. I would also tell people maybe don't get too worked up about seeing a specific animal. Some of my best wildlife experiences
Mhm.
were from animals that you would not think are so interesting.
Mhm.
Like, for example, water bucks are a dime a dozen in probably all of East Africa.
Mhm.
You see them everywhere, but we just happened to be there at the right time of year that we got to watch some of like the rutting calls and things like that. Um, so we saw a lot of fights between different groups. So even a lot of the less exciting animals, at least from a stereotypical point of view, can still put on some really good shows if you're willing to watch.
Fantastic. And let's take a pause on all these wonderful destinations we can't visit for the moment. And I, uh, I connect with travelers and travel bloggers that talk practical things. I like the practical parts, and this is mainly really for American travelers that have access to either the Charles Schwab debit card or the newer product that some listening may not be familiar with, SoFi Money. So talk about the benefits of those and why they're two ones that you recommend.
So both of these cards offer similar benefits, and that is a combination of them giving you cash access at the interbank exchange rate rather than throwing on a foreign transaction fee. They both also refund you the ATM fees, the actual machine fees for
Mhm.
each withdrawal. Those are the two main reasons that somebody would be interested in these, especially if you're traveling internationally several times a year, or for a long stint, even if you just go once, where you're
Mm-hmm.
going to be pulling out a lot of cash. If you only go to Europe once every 3 years, you're probably not in this group. So I'll just assume that everybody here is in this category.
But even if you're a domestic traveler, I mean, those ATM fee rebates apply
Yeah,
domestically as
that
well.
is true. So I forget about that because domestically, I'm always pulling out my credit card rather than
Yeah.
using cash. It feels like, so it becomes less of an issue.
I feel like even if you're one of those that just goes to Manhattan clubbing and you're pulling money out of some horrible ATM in front of the club each Friday night, you should get
Oh,
one of these cards.
it's been so long since I did that I forgot that was even a problem. But you are probably correct. Can't verify that. But yeah, that can save me even on a single trip, somewhere around $50. And if you do that a couple of times a year, that adds up to real money. So SoFi is the new player on the block. I don't know what their current interest rate is, but I know it is significantly higher than what Schwab is offering, by about 1%. So if you are putting more than a few $100s in there, that's something to be cognizant of. It might be a reason you choose SoFi over Schwab.
Yeah, I know a lot of people making it their primary checking now just because of that active interest rate, which typically is only with, say, high yield savings type products, which have
Right.
transaction limits.
Yeah. So I've actually been very pleased with their interface online. They make it very easy to move money back and forth with external accounts. If you do just want to move money in temporarily while you're traveling, for example. I haven't had to try their customer service, so I can't comment on it. I mean, it's a good sign that I haven't had to call them with problems and that everything just works the way that you want it to. So I don't know how their customer service is. I will say that Schwab is fabulous. Um, I've only had to call them once, but it was a real issue and they solved it for me in like maybe 10 minutes. So I was very pleased with that. And I've been using Schwab for years. So to have one issue out of probably 100 trips is pretty good batting average.
Oh, and Bobby in the comments is noting that SoFi just converted to Mastercard, so Schwab is Visa, SoFi is now Mastercard. So you've got different networks
Yes.
for your diversity.
And I do carry, now that both exist, I do carry both with me. I usually only have one of them in my wallet as I'm walking through town.
Yeah.
But I do like to keep the other one safely back at the hotel. If for some reason I lose my wallet, or if it's stolen, or if a machine eats my card or something like that, it's nice to know that you have a backup way to get cash.
And another one is phone calling. So if people, I think a lot in this group know Google Fi, but that's one that you converted to a few years ago from T-Mobile, and I had the same experience. T-Mobile may be free data and free text, but just I think the first few years of T-Mobile, they gave you a lot faster data than they advertised, and I was happy. And then
Yeah. So T-Mobile these days is, I think, somewhere around like 2G.
yeah,
It's
and that's what they always
painfully
advertised,
slow.
but it's just in the past either they couldn't control it and couldn't throttle it, or they were just being extra generous. But yeah, now they
Or
seem to.
or maybe it was so long ago that you got LTE so infrequently at home that you didn't notice the speed difference as much. I don't know.
I had at the time I had a corporate paid AT&T and personal T-Mobile, and they would often roam to the same networks, and in a lot of countries it was comparable.
Yeah, so I do like Google Fi when traveling abroad. I like that every time I turn it on, it just works. So if you land in another country, even if it's just for a layover of a few hours at the airport, it will recognize what country you're in and it will connect to those networks. So to me, the time savings and the convenience is worth something. Um, and then you get full speed, whatever that may be. It's often LTE, but if you're somewhere a little bit more off the beaten path, it might not be, just because the cell towers in that area might not be quite as fast or strong. But you do tend to get whatever the local equivalent of the highest speed is. And that's great. I personally don't go through a ridiculous amount of data, so to me, the price is not terrible. But at $10 a gigabyte, that could add up to quite a bit more than a local SIM card, especially if you're going somewhere like Vietnam where you can buy 5 gigs for $7.
Mm.
So it will be more than a lot of those countries. Maybe not as stark of a difference if you're going somewhere where the cell phone plans, especially on those prepaid cards, aren't as inexpensive.
I'm not even sure the status. I haven't been to Vietnam in a few years, but that's one that for a long time it was the treaty between the US and Vietnam had broken down. So I think what was it? Voice was roaming, but data wasn't across the providers. And I'm not even sure if that got resolved.
At one point, there was no service at all in Vietnam on
Hmm.
Google Fi.
I mean, on any of the US carriers, it was a bilateral thing. So it wasn't just Fi. Yeah.
Yeah, I do remember that because I do remember buying a SIM card there and it was so ridiculously cheap. I was like, well, why don't I do this every time? But then, like 2 days later, it broke and I had to go spend an hour in a line. It's one thing to get a SIM card at an airport shop where they always speak English and they do this
Yeah.
1,000 times a day and they pop your phone open and it's done in 10 minutes.
Mhm.
And another thing to be at the corner store of a town where they don't speak English and they've never used an American phone and they don't know how to change the settings. It was like, oh, yeah, this is why I don't do this because it just chews into hours that I would rather use seeing something more interesting when there's restaurants to eat at and museums to visit and activities to take part in compared to just standing in line and waiting.
Talk about those activities. How do you pick activities on your trips?
Well, some of them I will admit to just doing a lot of popular things, right? Things are 5-star UNESCO World Heritage sites for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
So there's our obvious ones. I do like to try some less obvious things also, though. One of my favorites is reading through Reddit threads rather than TripAdvisor forums or the similar. Reddit tends to be more frequented by locals, so you get local suggestions rather than TripAdvisor tends to be more tourists. I love looking at Facebook events. Those are often a lot of one-time events, sometimes festivals that you don't know about that might only be 10 minutes away, but you wouldn't necessarily accidentally walk by. So you can find them that way. I use, for some more active pursuits, I use Groupon a lot to find classes or businesses that you wouldn't find otherwise. Obviously, if you know somebody who's been there, that's always a good way to ask around as well. And if you don't know somebody, starting a conversation at a bar or in a taxi or any of the like, it's a tried and true method that's been around for as long as people have been traveling. And it definitely still works.
I'm not hearing a lot of either the TripAdvisor or the places like Viator, these kind of find a local guide type services.
I have used them, don't get me wrong, but they seem to be marketing more towards tour operators rather than actual attractions that might exist in a city. So instead of finding out about a museum that exists in the city, it will send you to like buy tickets to skip the line to get into that museum. So to me, that's less helpful. And the 15 top things. I was just in Mexico City a couple of months ago, and by I don't know, some moment of brilliance, I said, I'll just see what TripAdvisor has to say. And something like 8 out of the top 15 things were like food tours in Mexico City. And to me, a food tour, even if there's 8 operators, to me, that's one thing to do in the city, not 8 things to do. So I get a little frustrated, as probably a lot of frequent travelers do.
And speak about Mexico, because you've spent time studying there as well.
Yeah, I studied in southern Mexico in the state of Chiapas,
Okay.
in San Cristobal de las Casas. So that is definitely a touristy town. I can't deny that, but not touristy the way that Cancun would be. A lot of people probably haven't even heard of the entire state of Chiapas, or if they have, it's because they've been to like Palenque or one of the more archaeological sites rather than the city.
Okay.
It's a really cool part of the country. One thing I love about Mexico is just like the United States, every state feels very, very different, very distinct with lots of things to offer that you wouldn't find next door. Um, Mexico is an awesome place to spend an extended time, especially if you are able to do something like studying or something that has more of a local feel to it, because Mexicans and many Central Americans, and actually many people worldwide other than Americans, are just very welcoming to bring you into their community. They want you to be part of their culture. But I do think Mexico in particular, um, I don't know how much you've spent time in Mexico beyond just seeing kind of the more traditional tourist sites, but um,
I've
one of
had
the
many more business trips than leisure, but I've had a mix of both, but not nearly enough coverage of regions. Yeah.
yeah, Mexicans don't do anything by themselves.
Hmm.
And I'm an introvert by nature. So for me to do something by myself, I don't really even think twice
Yeah.
about it usually. But that's kind of unheard of in their culture. So I have very often been approached if people see me eating by myself. They'll come over and just for a moment they'll say "buen provecho" to wish me a good meal, but then it'll turn into a 20-minute or a 40-minute conversation, or well, don't you want to come over and have a shot of tequila with me? So I mean things like that. They just once you've introduced yourself and you're kind of in their circle, you're in their circle 100%. There is no halvesies. So that makes it a really nice place to study.
And compare that to, you also studied in Guatemala.
Um, Guatemala is almost like two countries in one from a
Hmm.
cultural standpoint. You have kind of the more Latino influence, and then you have more of the traditional Mayan, and there are many, many different variations of that depending on where you are in the country. Um, if you're in Guatemala City or some of the other bigger cities, you get more of that almost Western influence. A lot of the more traditional communities are much more reserved.
Okay.
They're very friendly, and I don't want to give the wrong impression because I did not meet anyone that I didn't like. Just a little bit more shy, I guess I
Okay.
would say. So it's kind of harder to make those immediate connections. You do have to put a little bit more effort. You might have to work up to it.
Hmm.
Very nice people and some incredible conversations that you can have if you do spend a week getting to know somebody. But for the average tourist in Mexico, you can get to know somebody in 2 hours and be their
Okay.
best friend. And in some of these more traditional highland communities of Guatemala, for example, you might spend 2 weeks getting to that same point in a relationship.
Okay.
Um, it doesn't make it any worse. It just
Hmm.
means um, you just have to approach it differently.
Fantastic. And so I guess the answer is choose both, but how about just specifically on the environment for learning and getting better at Spanish very fast? Is there a specific of the different study experiences you've had? Is there something to look for? Destination, curriculum?
I think I personally learned more in Guatemala, and some of that is because costs there are very low. It actually might be more even now. Mexico, the peso has really devalued, unfortunately, for their economy.
Hmm.
But at the time, you could buy a lot more in Guatemala than you could in Mexico. And the reason I bring that up is because I could afford to pay for private lessons
Okay.
in Guatemala, and in Mexico, I was paying for a combination of, instead of an entire half day of private tutoring, I would pay for like an hour of private tutoring and then like
Okay.
2 hours of group sessions.
Mhm.
Um, and at the point in my Spanish that I was at that point, um, being in a group meant a lot of times I was maybe wasting times on things I didn't know and speeding through other things that I really needed to focus on. So from that point of view, Guatemala was great. Guatemala is also great because, and some people don't recognize this, but for a lot of people in Guatemala, Spanish is actually their second language.
Oh,
because
okay.
they are using whatever dialect of their Mayan community as their first language.
Mm-hmm.
So because they have all learned Spanish as a second language, they're at times very good at teaching you
Mm-hmm.
because they understand the same struggles.
Mm-hmm.
And they also have a much clearer dialect or less slang.
Okay.
They
Yeah.
don't slur their words together quite as much. They speak more clearly. They enunciate a little bit more. So, from a student's standpoint, that can be very helpful, especially if you're more on the beginner or intermediate stage. I mean, I can't even imagine trying to go to like Chile, for example, and learn Spanish because that'd be like trying to learn English in Scotland. The accent is so thick, and you could do it, and it would be great to learn it if you had like a business reason or a family reason to be in that part of the world
Mm-hmm.
frequently where you wanted to learn that specifically. But if you're just looking for that more well-rounded language, Guatemala is great. Colombia would also be a really good one, just from the clearness or clarity of the version of Spanish they speak.
I've heard that in my business career. There's if your business involves any kind of customer service operation involved, there's always this debate about how much can you centralize in Latin America, your Spanish call center, or even serving North America. And Mexico is very different, and the Spanish spoken in the U.S. you've got every possible kind, and then within South America you've got everybody seems to say, oh, their Spanish is very pure and they'd be a good place to base it. But Colombia is the one I've heard the most votes that are the most credible of people
Yeah.
are like, well, my home country would be good, but if you need to choose another, Colombia is okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, and of course, if you do have a reason that you go to one place in particular, like business trips being the most obvious example, right, it would be the most beneficial to learn in that specific country. But if you're just looking for more general reasons, I would say go somewhere clear. And as long as you're choosing Latin America versus Spain, that's where you're going to find the biggest differences, obviously.
My dream of learning Spanish, I feel like, has ended when I went to Equatorial Guinea, because that was the last UN country that I hadn't been to that Spanish speaking, and I kept holding that out as motivation that I had these countries to visit, and there's many I want to revisit, but I've never taken to it. I feel like to learn a language, I would have another one. I speak Mandarin, Chinese, but at this
Well,
point,
that's another example
yeah.
of where dialects can be very different because even in a 1 week trip, if I was going from one city in China to the next, the 12 words that I thought I had learned, it was like, oh, well, you don't actually say it that way here.
Yeah,
So,
or you're saying it the way that they hear it on TV, but they only hear it on TV that way, and that's
right. So the Mandarin is another prime example. Arabic would be another one where
mhm.
there's 1,000 different ways to speak the language.
I missed the tie-in earlier when you were talking about buffaloes in Theodore Roosevelt National Park. Dave Moo's prior guest on the show in Buffalo, New York, where you're living. So tell us about the Canadian border. Is it really closed? Can we get across? What's it like?
So essential travel is allowed over the border. I do not have a personal excuse to have essential travel or to travel to Canada. Um,
But how is that defined and how is that enforced?
to be honest, I haven't really looked at the bullet points because I can't imagine that anything I would dream up would even fall into a gray area. I imagine there are definitely people that have family on one side of the border. For example, that
Mhm.
might be like I have to go take care of my mother who lives on the other side. That might fall into it. Me wanting to go into Ontario because they have great provincial parks that look different than the state parks in New York. Probably not a good example of essential travel. Um, yeah, I don't know. Like I said, I don't have even a slightly justifiable reason, so I haven't dug into the details. Um, Normally, it's actually quite easy to get across if you live in a border city the way that I do. I have a Nexus card, so it's very easy to get back and forth. And a lot of people here have Nexus cards. But even before I got that, one of my friends in Buffalo told me that you should never use your passport to cross the border if you live in a border town. You should always use your enhanced ID, which is a legal way to cross, because they see your local address and they just don't ask you questions. And I've experimented with that several times, and it's true.
Okay.
So I don't cross the border with my passport anymore. Unless I'm driving to Pearson Airport to fly to somewhere internationally. But otherwise, I cross with either my license or my Nexus card. They really do wave you right through, which is nice that most people can't take advantage of it, unfortunately.
Yeah, so this is the enhanced driver's license, which I'm trying to pull up an article here to see how many states have it, but it's generally border states with Canada that you can have the option in your state to apply. It's usually, say we're in Washington State where I am, there's a complicated way to get it because they haven't on a state level complied with the Real ID Act in terms of certain information sharing with the feds. So I wanted it when I first moved to Seattle, and it was too much hassle, and it was even ridiculous things like you need to present a utility bill, and so I have paperless statements, and so I print out the PDF, and they say this isn't original. It has to be the actual paper that's like was folded and you can prove was mailed to you, and I'm like this.
Wow.
So I have Nexus, but I don't have that. And I understand the political reasons. Let's see. It says it is available currently to Michigan, Minnesota, New York, Vermont, and Washington. So it's fewer than I thought. And then on the other side, British Columbia, Manitoba, and formerly in Ontario or Quebec. So Quebec, it says discontinued for low demand, but I'm sure there's a more story to that, and I don't see a quick answer on Ontario.
Yeah, and also worth noting, if you do have the Nexus card, which any state resident can get, although it might not be easy to find an interview center or an enrollment center if you don't live in a border area.
So this is a sibling program of Global Entry, but it requires an enrollment center both on the U.S. and Canadian side, not just the general U.S. Yeah.
But the interesting part is it's not just the Global Entry. You do also get the Canadian equivalent of TSA PreCheck for the faster security if you end up flying through Canada. Again, that might not actually be useful if you don't live in a border city, but
it's half the price of Global Entry, so
yes, although you have to pay cash. There are no credit card reimbursements that will pay for your Nexus card. I experimented.
You can use card, right? But you just won't get reimbursed. Yeah.
Right. I experimented in hopes that maybe Nexus would also be reimbursed by that $100 Global Entry credit that you can get on a dozen different credit cards these days. The answer is no, or at least not on the two that I tried, one for myself and one for my husband. So that's too bad. It is actually $50 cash out of pocket, but
yeah, we ran the same
experiment. Get my value out of it.
Yeah, and I for those Global Entry holders, I waited through the line coming back from Vancouver on the U.S. side. Because the Canadian side was never much of a delay. It was the U.S. I waited through it several times before one of the agents said, "Yeah, your Global Entry, you can just use your Global Entry card for the U.S. side. You can't use it for the Nexus lane going to Canada, but coming back to the U.S. I could have." And I felt like a real dope for not just sitting in these 45-minute lines a few times before learning that. So that's a good one to know for all of those that are border town. What is it like living on a border town? Is it factor in your daily life at all? I mean, Buffalo is of course a substantial city, so it's not.
Sure. So for me, it's a little bit different. I grew up in Rochester, which is about an hour from Buffalo. So I grew up with a very strong Canadian presence, even though I didn't grow up in a border town specifically. Toronto was always my closest major metropolitan area.
Okay.
Even though I live in the state of New York City is much farther away than Toronto is, for example. So if you wanted to do anything that you only find in major cities, the theater productions or the major sports teams, things like that, Toronto was always the closest answer for pretty much my entire life.
Okay.
And my grandmother used to live in Niagara Falls, so you could literally walk across the border, and I have memories of being like a 7-year-old or whatever, and we're going to Chinese tonight, and the better place to get Chinese food in Niagara Falls is actually across the border, and that was pre 9/11. So you would literally go and you would pick up your takeout and you'd bring it back home, and it was like you never even crossed a border.
Okay. Yeah.
Things are much different now. It's kind of cool saying that I can see Canada from my window, or if I'm taking a jog, I can cross into another country with, with the right card at least. But realistically, I don't do it that often, maybe 4 or 5 times a year. Not that big of a deal.
All right. Well, tell us what to do in Buffalo itself. We've heard of the Bills, and we've heard of Buffalo Wings, but there's maybe I'll link to an article where you highlight a number of things beyond beyond what the casual observer has heard of.
So this is normally festival season in Buffalo, and Buffalo does festivals like no other city I've ever seen. They get way into it. There's huge community support for anything and everything that you can think of. Unfortunately, most of these festivals are going to be canceled for 2020. Other than that, one of the things I like about Buffalo is that they really do try to blend the old with the new. For people who aren't familiar, Buffalo was a huge boom town at the beginning of the 20th century, like the first to have electricity, like tons of major money. Our parks were all designed by Olmsted, who also did Central Park in New York City. So we have a lot of claims to fame from 100 years ago, and then Buffalo kind of like died in the 70s and the 80s. And has really started to come back in the last 10-ish years. I mean, depending on who you ask, they'll all say it never died. Buffalonians have a lot of pride. As someone who is sort of from here, but sort of not, I can kind of maybe give a slightly less biased opinion. Buffalo is a nice place now. The downtown is beautiful. They've put a lot of money into areas. They've refurbished or repurposed a lot of old buildings. You can go tour the old Central Terminal, and they do a lot of special events there now.
Okay.
The old grain silos that they used to use for manufacturing. Some of them have zip lines or rock climbing courses, things along those lines. They're really just trying to kind of blend history in with new. And there's a ton of presidential history here. The Theodore Roosevelt National Historic Site is really cool, and I am not a history lover, so for me to say that is a big deal.
That's great. I've been steadily visiting the U.S. presidential sites, and the list keeps growing of what I'm visiting, but that one I've not visited yet.
It is very well done. We have some Frank Lloyd Wright sites, which is also nice to see. Most of those have been recently renovated. Again, kind of Buffalo trying to get back into the swing of things here. We have some really nice parks in the area, including, but certainly not limited to, Niagara Falls. That's just the most well-known. We also have Letchworth Gorge, which is one of the largest, gosh, I'm going to get this wrong. It's like the largest or the deepest or the somethingest gorge on the East Coast. I don't know what it is, but I know it is very beautiful. And that's outside the city. Very, very nice and easy day trip. But in general, Buffalo is kind of like Mexico, and people will take you under their wing, and they will be best friends with you, especially if you go to the bars. They're open till 4 a.m. I cannot personally do that. I'm Cinderella. My clock goes off at midnight. But even before that, Buffalonians are very happy to kind of talk to you, show you around. If you ask them a question 3 hours later, you will finally get the answer to it.
Buffalonians, huh?
Yeah, Buffalonians.
So it isn't buffaloes.
Yeah, we're kind of a cross between East Coasters and Midwesterners.
I suppose the one thing they don't welcome is lovable loser jokes about the famous football team, or
yeah, we tell some of them ourselves.
Yeah.
The good news is nobody can hate a Buffalo Bills fan because there's really no reason to hate us.
Yeah.
I'm not a huge football person, but I have started watching more games just because you have to when you live here. It's the big pop culture thing. If you go in anywhere on a Monday, well, obviously the conversation will center around that. So even though I hate football, I started watching it just because I don't want to be left out of conversations. But yeah.
Fantastic. And to borrow your word, I think it's the somethingest year in travel. We'll see what happens. But hopefully we'll be back sight doing soon. Thank you for joining us tonight, Becky.
Thank you. It's been fun.